All right.
And let's get going.
All right. Well, first off, thank you all for coming back. For those of you who, as she said, hopefully we're at the first session as well. I'm really excited once again just to be participating in something like this, and especially the topic that we want to talk about today. I feel like is a topic that is beginning to be talked about more and more and more, but at times is a little bit misunderstood, or at times we're not really properly addressing this whole issue of what does it look like to take care of those that are working in schools. I do think that, looking for silver linings behind things, what's happening with COVID-19 right now is beginning to shed a little bit of light on how important those that work in schools are, how important schools in themselves are, and the amazing work that you are all doing. So I think that that's positive, but at the same time, I think that it's going to be our role, it's going to be the role of administrators, it's going to be the roles of schools altogether to take the torch a little bit in terms of what does it look like for us to really be supporting ourselves? What do we need? And what are the reasons behind some of that? Why is it that we need some of this extra support? What does it look like to really be taking care of ourselves as we're trying to take those next steps forward? When I look at kind of what I think of as self-care and the direction that I want to take this, one of the things that I think is important to realize is that it's not all about us. Like, it's not all about the teacher. It's not all about the counselor. But instead, a lot of what I want to be looking at is why taking care of ourselves, why taking care of our staff is so incredibly important for our students, for those that we've been called to work with, but why it's also so incredibly hard. One of the things that I often say is that the greatest downfall of every teacher is the fact that we're a human being. And so all of these same stressors that a student might experience, all of the same difficulties that we talked about last week that we know that children are going through right now, we're going through them ourselves. Yet you're expected basically to be superhuman, handle all that yourself, and guide anywhere from 25 to hundreds of other young children going through that exact same thing and being able to support them accordingly. And so I want you to, right off the bat, just hear that from me, that when we talk about the role of the teacher, when we talk about the role of counselors, administrators, those working in schools, you're being asked to do something that's unbelievably impossible. But our goal is to continue to aim towards that and try to discover what types of supports we can put in both for ourselves and what types of supports can be put into the system that would allow us to be in the best spot possible to be able to accomplish that. So I'm going to share my screen with you here. Hold on. There we go. So hopefully that is properly sharing now. Let me know, Paula, if it's not.
It's not. It's not on the full screen yet.
All right. So sorry about that. How about now?
Perfect.
All right. Sorry about that. Thank you. And now I just need one more thing and I'll be good. All right, there we go. All right, so as was spoken earlier, what we're going to be diving into specifically in the second session here is mirror neurons and self-care. And so I want to make sure that we're not just looking at some of the feel-good ideas behind all of this, but in addition to that, we are always connecting things back to the brain science, wanting to understand what's going on within our brains, but also realizing the direct impact that that's going to have on the brains of the children that we have the opportunity to be working with. And so I want to really quick, I know that I showed this picture last week, and this time I just highlighted two specific elements of it. But as we think about this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, realizing that at the very top there, that's talking about our students and their actions and that huge role that we play in helping create their beliefs about themselves and their future actions. And so the two things that we, once again, as the adults in children's lives, the teachers, the counselors, the administrators, the support staff, whatever your role might be, we play a significant role in the lives of students because our beliefs about them dictate the actions that we take, and the manner in which we take those actions is going to impact our students' beliefs about themselves. And what I think is important is to realize that this is true on our best day, and this is true on our worst days. And so it's not as though this is something that we are able to turn on and off. And so when I think about that, even whether it's with students that I've worked with in the past, or even thinking about my own children at home, when I'm in a really good mood, I can look at their behavior and understand, oh, it's probably they're a little bit tired. It's probably, this is why they're reacting that way. And I know that they don't want to be behaving this way, but something else is happening. And then my actions are a lot more thought out and controlled. And that sends a certain belief to them. However, I also know that on my bad days, I'm so much more reactive. And so even if I just happen to be in a lower brain state, I'm grumpy about something, I didn't get a good night's sleep, my belief suddenly is, why is this child being so disrespectful to me? Why is this child being so rude? Why is this child being so self-centered? And so that's my immediate belief, my immediate response to some of the misbehaviors that I might see. And then that's also going to be dictated in actions. And so nothing changed about the child in that scenario. The only thing that changed is me. However, that changed the belief that the child has about themselves. And that's going to change their future actions as well. And so I just want us to be able to recognize what a significant role we play in creating our students' beliefs about themselves and realizing how really fragile that is because of how fragile we are. And so us not taking care of ourselves will directly impact our students' beliefs about themselves and their future actions as well. And so we need to be able to take that to heart as we're thinking through what are our next steps? What are the things that we want to be doing differently? And so one of the very common things, I'd imagine that many of you have seen this graphic before or something similar to this that's talked about anytime people often talk about self-care, is the whole analogy connecting it with, if you get on an airplane. And I know many of us probably aren't doing a whole lot of flying right now, but when you get on an airplane, they say in case of an emergency, put the oxygen mask on yourself first and then help those around you. And obviously that is a great analogy for then what does it actually look like in real life, taking care of ourselves first. But if you sit back and think about what are they actually saying here, they're essentially saying that if you try and help the person next to you before you help yourself, and then you pass out, now the person next to you has no oxygen mask on and you're dead weight laying on top of them. You've actually put them in a worse spot. And what I think is important to hear about that is that it obviously was not done purposefully. Obviously, this is not something that anybody would purposefully say, oh, I'm going to try and make things worse for somebody else. But I find that sometimes we inadvertently end up making a bad scenario for other people because we think we're being selfless. If we're not taking the best care of ourselves and then we try and support those around us, not only is our likelihood of being able to effectively support them go down exponentially, but we might actually be hurting them inadvertently in the process. Because what happens is if we're not as regulated, similar to what we saw on the last slide, we're going to not have the greatest beliefs about students. Our actions, our responses to their behavior are not going to be the way that we want them to be. We're not going to be able to dig as deeply into our arsenal of strategies and interventions that we otherwise would be able to. And so once again, by not really taking care of ourselves first, by not putting on that oxygen mask, so to speak, our capacity to support our students actually begins to go backwards. And so we might actually be making a worse environment for them. And so we need to be mindful of that and that negative impact that we're potentially able to have. And one of the first things that comes to mind when I think of the negative impact is, once again, that realization of where are our students coming to us from? And we talked about last week when we were looking at stress, the reality that a lot of our students, and especially thinking about where we're at right now with the whole COVID-19, many of our students are going to be coming to us operating often from that limbic level of the brain. And that limbic level of the brain is that social emotional part of the brain. It's that part of the brain that's asking the question, am I safe right now? Am I physically and emotionally safe? Am I cared for right now? But the other thing that's interesting about that part of the brain is that it pays far more attention to nonverbal communication than it does to verbal communication. And so when you're operating out of that part of the brain and you're looking at a teacher, if they happen to be in a bad mood, it doesn't matter if they're saying all the right things. They might as well be wearing that sign there that says danger, teacher in bad mood, because their nonverbal communication is consistently sending that message. And so we need to be mindful of what the message is that we're sending our students. Because if you really want to take that one step further, what most kids are going to ask next is why? Why is the teacher in a bad mood? And do they then get to put themselves in that narrative for the rationale for why an adult might be acting the way that they are? Is it hard to be in a good mood when you're around me? Is it hard to be in a good mood when I'm in that room? A lot of our kids right now, they already struggle to some degree being able to value themselves, being able to see themselves in that light. And we want to be extraordinarily cautious that we're not giving them any other reason to be thinking that way. That we don't want to be giving them any other reason to be thinking that they are unlovable, they're uncareable, but that, you know, we really want to be sending that message that you're somebody that's a joy to be around. You're somebody that I love spending time with. You're somebody that makes me happy just by being around you. That's the type of message that we want to be sending students. But we need to keep in mind that you can't really fake that message. That's a message that we need to be really, really thoughtful about. How are we going to be delivering that? And that can only be done well if we're taking care of ourselves. It can only really be done well if we're as regulated as we want to be. You know, fake it till you make it gets us a little bit of the way there, but unless we're making some actual changes to support ourselves and our own level of regulation, we're really going to have a tough time consistently sending the positive messages to students that we want to make sure that we're consistently sending to them. Now, one of the things I think is important to realize with all of this self-care talk is that it's not just happy thoughts and good feelings. There's actual science behind what this looks like and what co-regulation can look like. And so there are these things, as you saw in the title, called mirror neurons. And to put them most simply, mirror neurons are neurons that fire when you see something else occurring in the same way that they would fire if you were doing that thing yourself. And so if I were to yawn right now, especially if I was in a room with you, but even through the screen, you would likely yawn as well. That's because of mirror neurons. If you walk down a hallway and smile at people, about 70% of people smile back at you. That's because of mirror neurons. And additionally, if you were in front of a classroom of students, or if you're in front of one individual student and you're cool, calm, and collected, they're actually going to begin to become that way as well, because they have neurons seeing that basically are saying it's safe to feel that way right now. I'm replicating what I'm seeing right now. What's interesting, if you really look into mirror neurons and understand what their role has really been in humans for a long time, it's really how we've been able to develop rapidly as a culture, as human beings, because we see somebody doing something and then our neurons begin to wire in such a way that we can do that thing much more easily. And so we watch and learn. And while that's an amazing thing, it's also a little bit of a frightening thing. Because what we realize is that because of how our brains are structured that way, we're going to have children that are watching what we're doing, learning and replicating that behavior. And that's going to be the same for positive as it is for negative. And so once again, we want to make sure that we are at the best spot we possibly can be in, so that we are making sure that our students are then replicating the positive things that we would want them to be replicating, that they're going to be in a place where they could actually be seeing a lot of the good that we're doing, that we're handling stress in appropriate ways, that we're cool, calm, and collected under pressure. And that's going to teach their brain that that's a way that you can handle this as well. Whereas if in difficult times, we start to get more anxious, we start to get more worked up, we start to get a lot more reactive, that's actually literally teaching our students' brains that's how you handle situations like this in the future. And we want to make sure that we're really lining our students up with a template that would say, this is an appropriate way to handle this type of stress, so that our students can actually learn that and reroute to that in the future. And so I think that mirror neurons are actually an unbelievable tool that we're able to utilize to help our students. Because not only in the short term is this something that's going to help them to calm down. Simply by you being calm, they will have neurons firing that help them to feel a lot more calm in that moment as well. But they're also going to be learning from us, have neurons that are watching us, that are able to realize this is something that we can handle. This is something that is not physically unsafe, that my body's able to handle, and this is the appropriate way to really handle that type of stress. And so if we are able to take on the many stresses that find their ways into schools in as calm a way as possible, that's something that our students are then going to be able to replicate in the future and be far more likely to handle it that way. I think one of the most, eye-opening and sometimes positive, sometimes negative thing that I see, once again, with my own children or students, is when they replicate my behavior and it's not the type of behavior I would want to see them replicating. And I've seen that with my own children a lot recently in this, time of staying at home and working from home, where, I might see them do things that, I might do when I'm upset or when I'm frustrated. And I realize all they're doing is repeating the things that they've seen me do. And so we need to know that that's how their brains work, and that it's not really this conscious decision where they're thinking, oh, that seems like an appropriate way to handle this, but it's their brain saying, when a stress like that comes, this is the brain's way of responding to it. This is what you should do to be able to survive that, to be able to handle whatever's going on there. And so we realize that our students are really following through with what's happening in our brains, with how we're responding to different things that are going on around us. And so with that brain science in mind, we realize that we need to be really conscious of what are we doing? How are we responding to things? And if you take a step back from that, what we realize is we need to really be paying attention to how calm am I right now? How regulated am I right now? And if I'm not as regulated as I should be, that's going to play itself out in my actions, but also play itself out in my students' actions. And so where they're at any given point in time. The next two slides I'm going to show you are these graphs that I literally just made up. So don't overanalyze them. But I think that I just wanted to utilize something that I believe helps to kind of share a story of what I've seen happen even in my own classroom or classrooms that I'm observing, many, many times. And so basically what you see along the bottom of this graph is time. And so I basically took 1 hour, or, a typical class period, if you will. And along the left side is a non-existent number that somehow quantifies stress. And so there's some amount of stress or dysregulation that could be existing at any given point in time. And you'll see 3 lines now going across the graph. And so the blue line is the student, the orangish reddish line is the teacher, and then that gray line is the rest of the class. And so what you see in this first graph here with the code dysregulation is that one in particular student comes in and they happen to be at a 3 in my make-believe regulation level, and 3 is not good. You would want to be much closer to 0 to be calm, and up near 5 is going to be kind of in that terror state, if you will. And you see that the adult in this situation is coming in at a 2.5. So a little bit calmer than that student, but not really in a great spot. And the rest of the class is coming in at a 2. And so what happens is, over the course of this class period, there is going to be times that that student, especially that one that's at a 3, is likely to exhibit behaviors that need to be redirected. And so over the course of the class period, they might be talking out of turn, they might be not following directions, not doing their work. And so that teacher, several times over the course of this class period, is going to have to redirect that student. But here's what happens. Each time you have to redirect, that student is likely to get a little less regulated because nobody likes being told to stop what they're doing. And the teacher is going to get a little less regulated as well, because it's frustrating to keep having to tell a student to stop certain behaviors. And what's interesting about this as well is that as those two people that are kind of commanding the class right now are getting less regulated, you see that the rest of the class kind of follows suit with them as well. And so because the teacher didn't really start the day in as great a spot as they might have liked, you see that they are getting less and less regulated, meaning they're putting less and less time between their feelings and reactions. They're not really thinking through, what does this child need right now? How do I best support this child right now? But they're just getting frustrated. They're becoming far more reactive. And so you see that they're each getting less and less and less regulated until finally, either by dumb luck, the class period ends, or that child elopes from the classroom, or the teacher sends that child out of the classroom. And now the rest of that class is not only not nearly as calm as they were when the day started, but they're also stuck with a teacher now that is feeling pretty hyped, that is feeling pretty dysregulated right now. And so I've seen this happen again and again and again. And what predictably happens next is another student rises out of that rest of the class, or several of them do, where they're either trying to redirect that initial student, or their behaviors start to pop up as well because they're simply feeling more stressed. And so once again, it's not conscious, it's just that they're getting to a lower brain state and they're becoming far more reactive as well. And so now that teacher has so many more issues. I often call that kind of that domino effect, where it starts with one, but now there's two, there's three, there's four students that you're really struggling with a whole lot more, not sure how to support them. And so what we really want to see happen is that in this scenario here, what you see is that that child starts the day in the exact same spot. They're starting at a 3 because guess what? We can't really change where our kids are starting the day. And in fact, the rest of the class starts the day in the exact same spot because we can't control that either. And so they're starting at about a 2. But the one thing we have control over in this whole scenario is where we as the adults start the class. And so instead of being up high like we were in the first graph, this teacher's now starting down at that 1, which is going to be this nice, calm brain state. They're in a really good spot. And inevitably, that student is still going to exhibit behaviors that need to get redirected. But what happens here is that even though the child gets a little less, regulated after the first redirection, and the adult gets a little less regulated, the adult still has so much more room to move because of where they started the day. And so because of that, they are still able to think a lot before their actions. They're able to think about how they're communicating with the child. They're able to really process what's going to really support this child right now instead of what's just going to immediately try to get this child to listen to me or show my dominance over that. And so same with the rest of the class, they're going to at first maybe feel a little less regulated, a little less calm. But as that teacher maintains that level of calm, as they're able to continue to show respect or support to all students in the classroom, but especially that one that needs a little extra support that day, you see that everybody begins to get a lot more closely to where that teacher's operating from. And slowly you can see that the whole class and that individual student can actually become much more regulated and end the class in a much better spot than they otherwise would. Now, a few years ago when I first started doing my training, I saw a graph, not this one, but a graph similar to this. And I'll be honest, my gut instinct was, that looks really good on paper, but that's not what real life looks like. It's not as though everyone's just gonna magically, fall into this perfect dot on a graph. And so I realized that it doesn't always work this way. But what I found was interesting was a number of years ago, we had this student added to my school, and I'll call him Simon. And Simon, he wasn't in any of my classes. He was added with less than a month left in the school year. But anytime he and I had to interact, we were like oil and water. So if I saw him in the hallway, if I saw him at dismissal, if I saw him at lunch, we just had these immediate power struggles amongst the two of us. And so it always just ended poorly between he and I. But nonetheless, we survived the end of that school year. And that summer was when I ended up doing my intensive training with the Child Trauma Academy. It's when I started to learn a whole lot about trauma and the brain and understanding all of this. And so I'm learning about how the brain works. I'm learning about this whole idea of co-regulation and putting together a plan for myself to make sure that I could really be as calm and regulated as possible. I'm figuring out what tools, what strategies do I need to put in my classroom to support my students. And it was also that summer that I got the email that said, by the way, Simon's going to be in your second period class every day next year. And I'm not going to lie, my gut instinct was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with this kid? But after that initial reaction, after my initial, quite frankly, poor response, I began to just think, you know what, I can help him. I've got things in place. I've got tools ready that I'm going to be able to help him. I can create an environment where I know that we can work well together, and I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to be calm. I'm going to be regulated so that I can help him out. The school year starts, week 1 goes by, honeymoon period, no problem. The first day of the second week of the school year, Simon walks into my class and he looks at me and says, you know what, you might as well send me out now. I'm not in a good spot to be here today. And I looked at him and I said, you're welcome to walk out the door if you want to, but I'd really like you to stay. We've got a lot of great stuff to cover, and I'd really like for you to be part of it. And Simon chose to stay in my class that day, and Simon was true to his word. He was not in a good spot to be in class that day. And so over the course of the class period, he did every little thing you can think of to kind of be, frustrating or that ended up getting under my skin a little bit without crossing certain lines of, creating an unsafe environment or completely taking away from other students' ability to learn. And so, but what I think is important to hear in this is that I really was taking care of myself. I really was probably somewhere nice, low, in a really good brain state for this. I was really calm. And so I was able to work with him. And what I realized is that before the very first time that I needed to talk to him, because I was regulated, I was able to put more time and thought between feelings and reactions. And so in that split second, I was able to realize, you know what has always happened between Simon and I last year when we had all these negative interactions? And it was that we always had these power struggles between the two of us. We would always have these times where we're going back and forth. And what I realize is it takes two people to have a power struggle. That's not just him. I can't solely blame the student for that. I play a role in that as well. And so I needed to be able to pay attention to that and realize I'm a teacher and I'm an adult. That's all the power I need. I've already got tons of power. So I need to make sure that I'm not doing anything else right now that's going to exert any more power towards him. I realize that I'm 6'2" and he was a 9th grader. And so before I would say a single thing to him, the first thing I did was I would take a step back if possible. If possible, I would sit down in a chair, sit on a desk, lean against the wall, make myself a little bit smaller. I'm taking some of that power away. I'm putting more distance between us. Standing up makes it look like I'm looking down at him, taking steps towards him, even though it might be that I'm trying to just be more friendly or talk to him. That can seem like I'm coming into his space. And so I wasn't trying to take any of that power. I was trying to take power away from myself by making myself calmer. I realize I have a fairly low voice, so I try and soften my voice a little bit and say, hey, Simon, I see that you want to be, whatever behavior it is that he's exhibiting, it's a little disruptive. I can't let you do that right now. Fill in the blank for whatever it was he was doing. And I'd love it if you could come and do some work. I'd love it if you could come and, get to your desk right now. And this is a 45-minute class period. At minute 37, Simon finally got back to his desk and he sat down and started work and worked for the remainder of the class period. Now, please don't misinterpret. I'm not saying that 8 minutes of a 45-minute class period is anything that impressive. But what I do think is impressive is that I checked in with his other teachers thereafter, 3rd period, 4th period, 5th period, 6th period. And I kept hearing the same messages from them. And that was that Simon did fantastic today. Simon did all his work today. Simon's behavior was on point today. And what I realized is that even though he missed out on the most important class period of the day, which was my 2nd period English class, was that despite that, he was able to become regulated. What you see on the screen right now actually happened for him, where he was able to come and meet me at my level of regulation. And that really set him up for a successful remainder of his day. And what I think is also interesting is, once again, that gray line, that rest of the class there, they were able to maintain a great level of regulation throughout this process and probably even became a little calmer by the end of all that really happened that day. And I've seen this occur as well, not only in my own classroom, but in other classrooms again and again and again, where if that teacher is really able to maintain that level of calm, you begin to see the students replicate that as well. You begin to see that that's something that can play out with every single person in that room, that they can meet that level of calm too. Sometimes people will ask, like, what about those other kids? Weren't they getting annoyed at the process? Weren't they getting, frustrated at that other student? And really, when the teacher is calm, that usually doesn't happen. What does happen often is that as the teacher is getting more and more frustrated and upset, as they're raising their voice a little bit more, that's when you begin to see other students having the negative response and the negative reaction. Maybe they're stepping in, trying to solve the problem at that point in time. And that's what often begins to create a more negative classroom experience for everyone. And so instead, what we're realizing is that that level of calm from the teacher really plays a significant role in supporting every single other child in that room and being able to get them, once again, where we want them to be. The other thing that I think is important to hear in this story is that all of the different interventions that we've talked about in some of the past sessions that we've been together were things that I offered to him. I offered for him to have, different furniture. Do you want to sit in a rocking chair? Do you want a desk cycle? Do you want to go take a walk? Do you want to do a brain break? Do you want to get a drink of water? Do you want to fidget? And he said no to everything. But the one thing our students can never say no to is how calm we're going to be. One thing our students can never say no to is how we're going to treat them. And so even if you don't have any of the tools, any of the interventions that we've talked about before, we in and of ourselves have the unbelievable ability to be able to support our students. We in and of ourselves have the ability to help any student to calm down by how we're interacting with them, by how we're treating them, by how we're responding to that behavior. Now, don't get me wrong, it takes time. It took 37 minutes for me to be able to help Simon calm down, where I've seen students that were far more amped up than him get regulated in 10 minutes with the right tool and the right strategy in place. And so it does take time, but we do have the ability within ourselves to be able to support every single student and help them to be able to become regulated. But it starts with us being regulated ourselves. It starts with us being cognizant of this and making a plan to make sure that we are supporting ourselves as much as we possibly can. And so in the last few sessions, one of the things that I did in the middle was ask you to do a brain break. This time I'm going to ask you to do something slightly different. I'm going to ask you to do a reflection break, if you will. And what I want you to really just take a moment, and I'll explain it, and then I'll give you about 30 seconds to consider it. But I want you to really begin to think through, what are the things that you do to stay regulated throughout the day? And what I want to be clear about here is that there are some things that people do in life that are just great. Like you know, some people wake up and they run a 5K every day, or you do yoga, or there's music you listen to on the way to work. And, you know, there's amazing things like that that people do. But what I think is really important is that from the moment your work day starts to the moment that that day ends, there's a whole lot of stress in the middle there. And so we need to be thinking through, how do we handle that stress? How are we dealing with that stress? And so what I really want you to be thinking through, and I realize that things are a little bit different right now because you're working from home, and that brings about a whole different level of stress. But what I want you to think through is, what are things that either you already do or things that you could do over the course of a typical day that would help you to stay calm, that would help you to become a little bit more regulated? And so I'm going to, like I said, ask you to take about 30 seconds to consider that. And I'm also going to ask, if you're willing, and it's something that's kind of short and easy to show, if you wouldn't mind sharing that in the chat box as well. If you would kind of just quickly type in one of the things that you do to take care of yourself over the course of the day. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to do that right now. Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of responses. Thank you guys so much. All right, I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds, and I'll take some advice and actually take a drink of water. So first off, the reason that I like to do a discussion like this, and, you know, if we were live, I'd have you, you know, get into groups of people and whatnot, but is that I feel like you can learn a lot from other people. And so even just skimming through that list really quickly, there is a lot of really great strategies and ideas right there. And I feel like the people that you're going to learn the most from are the people that are in a similar situation as you. And so sometimes by having conversations like this and by hearing what other people are doing, we can actually get a really good idea of things that are going to be advantageous for us, things that you might have never considered trying to do before that maybe perhaps now you do want to be able to try. And so I would encourage you, you know, take a look at the chat, you know, especially before you log off at the end of this, and see if there's any ideas that other people have shared or even are continuing to share that are things that would be beneficial to you, that are things that you might be able to pull out and begin to plan. Here's what I know for a fact. If you don't make any actual plan to do something different, nothing's going to change. You know, if you were a first-year teacher, the one thing that'll change is that things get a little bit easier year after year, just in terms of some of your planning and preparation. But if you're not really putting in a plan for how am I going to take care of myself better, chances are it's not going to miraculously change year after year. You're going to continue to be stressed. You're going to continue to be dysregulated. And so really what I would encourage you to do is begin to make a plan for, what do I need to do for myself? How can I best support myself? What are the things that I can put in place that are going to help me? And that might look different for different people. I know, there's some folks over at the Sanctuary model that Sandy Bloom runs, where they do, self-care plans. And you could actually, they actually encourage people wear it around your neck, a little card that reminds you of like the things that you do to help you through certain difficult and trying times. I'm a big fan of just like the Post-it. And so I would have just a few Post-its on my desk and on my laptop that just reminded me of different tools that I could do. But put a plan in place that you could actually begin to follow, where you're building out some of those reminders, if you will, throughout the course of the day that are going to help you to do things that work for you. Try something new, try something different, but trust yourself as well. You know what works for you, you know what doesn't work for you, but try to just do something different, because doing the same thing is not going to all of a sudden bring about any type of different results unless we take some steps forward to be able to make any changes. So I would like to share with you all just some of the most common ones that I've seen, and I saw that these were represented to some degree on your list, but when we would go out and do some live trainings, this is something that we would always just try and learn it and just keep our list updated, some of the most common ones that people are talking about. But one that I think is extraordinarily important is just stepping outside, getting that change of scenery. And so and I saw a few of you mention that. Some of you mentioned like walk outside and do a lap around your school building. That's amazing. That's so important, just to get out from under the lights. Not only is the physical movement element of that good, where instead of just being stationary all day long, you're actually getting physical, but getting out from, just a different setting. Your eyes are now going to be able to see something that visually looks different. That's going to be more stimulating to your brain, help you to wake up a little bit more. And so finding a way to just physically move your body is going to be an important thing to do. Taking care of your basic needs, eating, sleeping, obviously not sleeping when you're at work, but making sure that you are just taking care of those things that your body needs. What I found interesting personally was that as a teacher, in my first couple of years, I never stopped for lunch. Like there was just always so much work to be done, always something that could be done then. And so I basically never ate lunch. And I would always find that my students in the afternoon were so much more difficult than my students in the morning. And then suddenly, once I started taking care of myself better, I started making sure I was eating lunch every day. And magically, my students in the afternoon began to behave better. And I realized that perhaps the issue wasn't them, the issue was me. I wasn't taking care of myself. And so it was more about me not being in a good spot to respond to them. Taking care of our basic needs, like making sure that we're hydrated, that we're well fed, that's something that activates the lowest part of our brain, our brainstem. And so taking care of those things is going to help us to be less reactive. And so make sure that we are being mindful of that. And then this kind of jumps into the next slide, but I know that some people are just afraid to drink because when are you going to get a chance to pee? Make sure that you have a plan in place for that as well, and that you're talking to your leaders for being able to create, the ability. We shouldn't be not eating and not drinking because we're afraid that we're not going to have the opportunity to do anything about the biological needs of that later on in the day. So be making a plan for that, but be advocating for yourself. One that, I started doing a lot is leading your class in a brain break when you feel like it's something that you need at that point in time. And I think this is really important because if you're not in a good spot, chances are your students probably aren't going to be either. And so taking that time to just lead them in a brain break, it's going to be beneficial to you, which is in and of itself definitely going to be beneficial to them. One of the things that I think is interesting with brain breaks is, sometimes people are concerned with like, is this another, power struggle where I need to get my whole class going and why isn't this student involved? Why isn't that student involved? My big recommendation with brain breaks is that you really just allow the students to choose whether they want to opt into it or opt out of it. And don't make it another power struggle. It's meant to be something that helps everybody. And so don't create it into something that's going to be harmful to anyone. There were times in my class where I was trying to lead my class in a brain break and I was the only one participating in that activity. But what's important to realize is that that benefited my students because it put me in a better spot. So I was able to support them better. And especially in the early days, it was kind of often that it was just me and one or two other students, but slowly they began to see that this is, a normal thing. So even if I stopped class because I needed one, it began to get to the point where I would have a lot of students joining in with me as well. Talking to a friend, figuring out who has an off period when you do, who has availability when you do, but also being really careful about who it is that you're talking to and how you're talking. You know, sometimes you kind of have the colleague that you talk to and they're always just like, man, these kids are the worst. Like, we got to fix this. And, you know, that just, you know, adds fuel to a fire that doesn't really make things better. And so have those friends that actually you just have a lot of respect for their ideas, their solutions, they help you problem solve, or even just have times that you know, see somebody for 10 minutes, you have lunch with them, and you make that commitment. We're not going to talk work at all here. Like, this is just a place where we chat about our families or we talk about our weekend plans, but we're not going to talk work. We're not going to talk students at all, just to mentally give you that break, to give you that kind of breath of fresh air away from the work that you're doing. I think I saw a couple of people write this, but planning well and being well prepared. And so this is something that I think is extraordinarily important, where if you're not thinking about what am I going to do third period, do I have enough, you know, handouts for everything, where's all my materials at? If all of that is organized, suddenly all of your attention can now go to the needs of your student instead of the needs of your day. And so it helps you to just give your attention back to them. It lowers your stress because it takes away some of the things that you might be a little bit more worried about in that point in time, and puts you in the best place possible to support them. This kind of goes to what I was saying on the last slide, but setting an alarm on your phone for breathing or mindfulness, I think that phones are an unbelievable tool, especially when it comes to helping to support us through our own level of self-care. And so putting an alarm on your phone that just reminds you, like, take a deep breath or do this brain break, do this mindfulness activity. And obviously trying to do it at a time that perhaps you would actually have a moment to do that, not when you're in the middle of a lecture. But getting those little moments, those little reminders, is a great way to actually force you to do something different. Once again, if we don't put a tangible plan in place, chances are we're really going to struggle to actually do anything different. And so instead, this really helps us to have that plan in place. It puts those reminders right there in front of us that's going to increase the likelihood that we actually do something different. And then lastly, you know, keeping a drawer of memories to remind us of basically why we're doing this. Those pictures that students give us, those letters that they've written us, just different things that they've created over time that, and this is actually one that I did and that I even still do to this day, where, you know, if I'm having a bad day, I might just reach into the drawer and just have that reminder of, like, yes, good has come from the work that I'm doing. Good has come from this. And it doesn't feel like it today, but tomorrow's a new day. And so it's just kind of that reminder that there is a greater purpose behind all of this. So once again, this is a short list. There's actually a much longer list that is in the chat box. So once again, I would highly recommend looking at that, jotting down notes for some of the things that work for you. And then once again, being able to put a plan in place for yourself. What are you able to do? What's going to help you? When can you fill some of these things into your agenda? And then the other piece that I want to talk about with this is some of the bigger kind of school-wide changes, some of these kind of larger things, especially if there's anybody that is in leadership or administration. These are some things that you want to be talking about. If you're not, these are things that you might want to be advocating for. But one of the most consistent things that I've heard teachers say to me is that they realize not only that they need more support, that they need to be able to take care of themselves better, but often they're even able to say the things that would be advantageous to them, the things that would be helpful to them. But what they also say is that they are scared that if their supervisor or an administrator comes into their room and sees them doing anything other than lesson planning or, you know, grading tests, that they're going to get in trouble for it. And so really, we need to make sure that our schools and our districts are operating in a way that puts a extremely high value on the need for staff to be taking care of themselves. And we need to make sure that that is well communicated again and again. And quite frankly, that we're even putting things in place that shows that this is something that we highly encourage and support. And so making sure that as you're putting, you know, perhaps together regulation tools or equipment for students, that we're also getting things for staff, or that we're making sure that it's available for our staff as well. So are we putting that in our staff lounges? Are we encouraging our staff to utilize some of those tools that are in their room? And also, are we talking to staff and figuring out what's something that would help them? Is there something that we could put in place that would make their lives a little bit better, that would make their lives a little bit easier as well? when we start to, give out different gifts to staff for different reasons, whether it's holidays or birthdays and whatnot, we're trying to think through not only what would they like, but are there things that we could put in there that would really help them throughout the course of the day to support them, to help them. We've been giving out a lot of fidgets to staff, some like little like weighted equipment to staff, things that would be supporting them and helping them to be in a better spot, not only for themselves, but then that's going to reflect itself on their ability to support our students as well. Opportunities for open dialogue between staff and admin. I think part of it is just creating that and making sure that both sides are being heard. I'm in a unique spot where I work a lot with those that are on the front lines, the teachers, the counselors, and then I also spend a lot of time talking to administrators. And I've shared several times with administrators that staff are feeling unsupported, and they'll quickly go off and say, well, we've done this, and we've done this, and we've done this for our staff to help support them. But there's often, and obviously not everywhere, but there's often this disconnect where they're doing things to support their staff for sure, but the staff aren't either recognizing that those things are even available or what the thought process was behind them. And so creating opportunities for that communication, I think, is going to be really important. And so with that, that's going to help to prioritize the staff needs. It's going to help to, once again, create that as being a focal point, because we realized by shedding a lot more light on our staff and saying, what do we as a district do to support our staff, will have a direct impact on how well we are supporting our students. And once again, not trying to, over talk about this, but coming into this upcoming school year where things will look different as students are coming back from COVID-19, we are going to be depending a ton on our staff to not only be educating our students, but to really be that barometer of calm for how we're going to be able to handle all of these new things, all of these new supports. And so that's got to be incredibly important. And then last one, I've heard of a lot of schools that put in place different like buddy or support systems. So when a teacher realizes, I'm just not in a good spot right now, and I need 30 seconds to 3 minutes to just get out of my room, take a walk, get a drink of water, I just need to take that, deep breath for myself. Just having that person that I call, that's no questions asked. I don't need to explain, hey, here's what's going on. Here's why I'm upset. It's just like, hey, I need 30 seconds. I need a minute. And just having that, system in place that there's somebody available that you're able to reach out to. Once again, just making sure we're putting something in place, because what we know is that keeping that adult in that room at that time, while it creates perhaps physical safety, it's not putting the students in the best spot, and it's not helping the teacher. And sometimes we just get stuck, because once again, with where I started, the hardest part is the reality that we're human beings and we need help. We need support. We can't just magically do this all. And so creating an environment and putting specific things in place that is able to help us and support us so that we're in the best spot for our students is really how we're going to be able to create schools and systems that are going to be supporting people, not only those that are working within it, but all of those that were there to serve. And so that's the overarching goal behind all of this. And so with that said, we're right about at the 50-minute mark. So I want to open it up for any questions that people might have. Once again, feel free to type them in, or you can also unmute yourself and share anything that you'd like to ask. Oh, that's funny. So real quick, while some people are writing things in, I like how many of our students would suggest that we, the teacher, need a timeout? And I think that that's such a good question, such a true thing as well. We're gonna talk about these slightly next week, but there's one teacher in particular that we worked with who he had put a calming corner in his classroom and was trying to explain to his students, like, this is a space where you can go when you need a break. This is a space where you can go to help you get regulated when you're having a bad day. And I think that the students weren't very quick to buy into it, because they very much just viewed it as this like disciplinary thing, and you're in trouble, you're bad. And the teacher was having a bad day and was just having a tough time with the students. And so he put himself in the calming corner and just went and sat there himself. And the students were like, oh my goodness, Mr. So-and-so's in the corner. But it was such a telling moment, because he was able to just be really transparent. Like, yeah, I have bad days too. I have days that I need a little extra support too. And while it's kind of funny, because it was kind of like, in the students' eyes, the version of the teacher getting the time out in that moment in time, but it also began to kind of break down a wall between them, like a little bit of that power differential that exists that reminds them, yeah, we're all in this together. We're all humans that perhaps are struggling with some of the same things, but also it tore down, and we'll talk about this next week, but it tore down some of the stigma with utilizing regulatory tools as well, where now the students felt far more interested and likely to embrace some of these different things because they realized, man, if the teacher's doing it, needs it, maybe it's something I'd be able to use. And he told me that was a turning point, and from that point on, the students really began to use that calming part of his classroom a lot more often.
This is the opportunity to ask more questions if you'd like to, either writing them through the chat or opening up your mics and asking, or maybe sharing as well.
And once again, if you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable sharing with the larger group, my email's there. Don't hesitate to send any questions you might have to that email address, and I'd be happy to support and help however I can.
Okay, do you see the question there, Josh, from Debbie?
You know what? At the moment, I don't have anything that readily comes to mind about mirror neurons. I apologize for that, but I'll look into it and see if it's something I can share with you guys in the near future. Yeah, it's been probably a couple of years since I researched it, so I do apologize for that.
Okay, Aaron asked, for those who aren't reading the chat, what are some examples of regulation tools and equipment for staff?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the short version of it is almost anything you would put in place for students, you could put in place for staff. And so part of it is just that communication. But we've done things like making sure that we have desk cycles or desk ellipticals that staff would be able to utilize as well. Getting them, fidgets, teaching them brain breaks and different exercises like that. I've worked with a lot of schools that have begun to put in place just like, opportunities where staff would come earlier, stay a little longer to do, yoga together or different things like that. And once again, the school is just creating the space and the opportunity for them to be able to do that. One of the things that I found with adults now, there's kind of the differential between what they can do during the day, which is quite frankly, once again, a lot of just that equipment. So that you would use for students. There's really not a difference between this works for an adult and this works for a child. We all have the same basic brains, and so it kind of regulates them similarly. But then also just talking to staff and seeing what it is that they need. And so, we've had some schools that they actually just put together like book clubs where they would read different books as a staff or optional things that they'd be able to do. But for them, it just helped to create that like kind of limbic bond between each other that helped them throughout the course of the day to regulate better, and or participating in different kind of team building opportunities like that. Even just consistent meetings where people have the opportunity to speak and collaborate together. Once again, it's going to look different for what supports different people, but just that community building, that opportunity to hear and be heard, I think is pretty crucial for a lot of adults often. But when it comes to during the course of the day, I mean, really the list of things that we looked at for students, I would 100% just replicate that and say, see what works for you as well with that.
Okay, thank you. There's a comment after that about being proactive in their plan. Do you see that?
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, you know what? That's such a good point that actually I meant to say and I neglected to say, which is that the mixed message. I worked with somebody a while ago who always would say, like, if we're not really taking care of ourselves, we might have the best ideas, the best interventions, but it would be like serving the most amazing meal on a trash can lid. If we're not taking care of ourselves, these things can all be kind of misutilized. So for instance, one of the things that we did at one of Lakeside's schools early on that was an amazing tool was we, kind of in the middle of campus, we were able to put in this walking track. And it was this amazing tool for students where, if they were having a tough time, like they had to get teacher permission that they could go walk the track for 5 minutes and come back to class. And it was so calming, and that worked for a lot of kids. But then it kind of got to a point where some teachers would be like, you know what, get out of my class, go to the walking track, you need a break. And it turned into a punishment instead of the tool that was designed to help. And so I do think that being proactive, thinking about how we talk about it, creating such a plan, and also working hard to tear down the stigma of why do these things exist and what are we doing with it. So yes, I think that is a really good point.
I just want to mention that I've seen the walking track. It's around a lake in a kind of park-like forest, which is the most regulating and calming background I've ever seen in a school before. Does anybody else want to add anything or ask anything else? Okay, then I think we're going to stop for now. Josh, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
And